as we are now having a real reckoning about the history of violence and white supremacy in our country, police brutality, etc., there is, you know, there are more things that we need to be prepared, and sort of some very specific types of trauma. So, and content related things. So Vanessa will be talking about that, though Vanessa also just got up and stepped away from her computer for a second. So, oh, here we go. So I don't believe, Vanessa, that I got a bio from you, so I'm just gonna riff. So Vanessa is an independent scholar, a classicist. She is currently located in Seattle. She has been involved in a lot of the protests in Seattle, in the Chaz that was chopped, that was the name changed a bit, but I've been getting a lot of really great updates from her from the other side of our state. She has done some amazing work, which I will share, on reception of Greek literature in America, specifically in the context of race. She's spectacular. So she will be talking to us about race and teaching and other such things. So I'm gonna turn it over to Vanessa. We'll have about 40 minutes of Vanessa. I know sometimes people have to leave at like an hour from starting time. This will be recorded. If you miss the end of her talk, you can absolutely watch the end of it later. But also, I would encourage you to stick around for the whole time, and then we'll have some discussion time for everybody at the end. So without further ado, Vanessa.
Thank you, Amy. Yes, I actually very intentionally did not send anything because I'm always slightly curious as to how I'm received and to my own reception and to how I come across to people. So that was a very good look and interesting. So hello, everyone. I'm gonna actually change my view so I'm less nervous. There we go. That's better. Now I have all of you. I'm here to talk to you today about race in the classroom. So it's nice. It's a very like specific, narrow topic that we can hanker out in 5 minutes. Race is, as I'm sure all of you are trying to think about and conceive of right now, kind of a strange and interesting and weird topic to bring about in the ancient classroom, especially. And that was something that I always encountered from a young age, from 14 onwards, taking high school Latin, where race and slavery and things of that nature would always like bubble up in a very strange way, but never really go anywhere in like a deep and more meaningful way until I went to college. And looking back at everything now, and when Amy asked me to sort of give this talk and talk to everyone, I was really kind of puzzled and befuddled about like how basically to give this talk, or how to just even talk about like what to do with race in the classroom, and like especially to a bunch of different educators that like I don't know. So I'm like, okay, so we're thinking like high school classrooms then, I guess. We're thinking undergrad classrooms, probably some grad classrooms, maybe some tutoring, maybe like a little bit of middle school. I'm not sure, probably not too many though. But a wide range and variety, but especially of students that are of the teenage age and older going forward for the most part, which are generally the age of when identity and all of those things are starting to crop up. So race and gender and sexuality are things that are actually incredibly important to young students. So we actually need to go all the way back. So I was trying to think about like, should I just give them like an overview about like race in this country? Should I give them an overview about classics in this country? Should I give the overview about how classics and race have intersected in the academic system in a crazy way in this country? Should I talk about strategies that like other people have been working on? And I was really sort of going around in circles until I just decided to do what I tend to do in my own research, which is that I'm really good at finding just like gaps or like lacunas in whatever like situations or things people are looking at, which makes me really good at asking questions at talks. And so I was trying to sort of look at like the gaps and lacunas around like our field and race, and like how we've actually been addressing it to sort of like draw some bigger picture suggestions too. Because honestly, like, here's some of the like bare things that we need to go over. Number one, classics helped form race in this country. Race was a very, very interesting, wild thing that popped up in the 16th and 1700s, and a lot of different fields of study went into reinforcing it. The sciences, very sadly, like, are still dealing with undoing a lot of their eugenicist trends and things like that. However, the humanities, I think, are less good at looking at how deeply, I think, race impacted the formation of the humanities, especially like the 19th century Germans and like everything they were doing, which, like, guilty. Like, I love 19th century Germans and everything that they were doing. Mostly the composers, actually. I didn't study the philosophers till later. But, and then also just like America, we're such a like new country, and like that's something that's really hard to point out to anyone, actually, but especially classicists, which is, I think, the saddest part. Like, we are the ones who study thousands and thousands of years of history. We are able to see such large scope of these things, and yet a 250-year-old like nascent political system that's still going through all of its like wheels and cycles of propaganda and trying to establish its belief systems. Like, it's, America is something that is very hard to critique in the contemporary academic field, which I get. Like, it's a very, very large question that's still being answered and still forming itself. So it's kind of hard to comprehend. However, like, studying the ancient world, doesn't that give us the best tools to understand these large, large questions? And so I think the first sort of point of the impact of classics around race in America is one that can't really be ignored. I can't ignore it because my dad's from Athens, Georgia, and like it is called the classical city, like, of the South. But it's like, even then, like, I always grew up on the story that like he would tell me, like, jokingly laughing, he's just like, yeah, so they named it Athens because it has 7 hills. And I was just like, what? He's just like, yeah, they sucked. They were bad classicists and didn't realize Rome was the city with 7 hills. It's like, that's always the story my dad would tell me about why they named Athens, Georgia, Athens, Georgia. And it's like, there is so much strange like tension between race and like neoclassical architecture when you go and visit the South, when you see all of these things sort of collected together, like in like front of you in your gaze. And like, for me, it was always so starkly like clear. And like, part of that was because like I had a Black father from the South and a white mother from Oregon who like went to the South to just do some like Mennonite service work and ended up teaching inner city middle school, and like, which is a very intense first teaching experience for anyone to have, like, especially in the 80s. Like, she had some of her students die and other like things that she went through, and then like was suddenly pregnant with a mixed race child in the 80s teaching middle school, which was another very intense experience that she had. So, and the impact especially on classics, on like the founders of our country, like I was very, very bored by, I think, like a lot of my ideas of what classics was growing up, because like guys and blah 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 blah, and you always had pedantic men that were boring to listen to quoting Aristotle and Plato. And oh no, did my video just go? No. Okay, good.
Did you freeze up for a second, but you're back? I don't know if that was everyone's experience, but you're good.
Sorry. Yeah, if that happens too much, also, like, I'm in a weird spot in my house, I could also move slightly. So there is a strong tension between race and classics, and that often erupts in the classics classroom in very strange ways, often around the topic of slavery, which is a really, really interesting topic. And I think this is also one of the bigger problems of classicists, is that our field is one and such that there is so much knowledge, like there's just too much. And it's like the average classicist is kind of expected to know way more than we should. There's a strong culture of like trying to seem like you know much more than you do, of like constantly trying to be like, oh yeah, no, like I do know this thing, like, yeah. And I think I first encountered that from like public school Latin teachers who would just like frantically like try to suddenly like be experts on these things in the ancient world that they weren't, then be experts on like those same parallels in American society, which they weren't, and trying to like really mash these things together in a way that just made everyone in the class so much more confused. And so I think that if classicists could also like admit things that they don't know, which is hard. That is literally like, and I get it, like that is antithetical to being a classicist. Like we literally are constantly like trying not to share like how much we don't know, because there's so much of a culture of just like, oh, well, you don't know like your proper Latin, or like, well, your Greek grammar is off, like, but, and like just sort of nitpicking and a competitiveness in this field that like can be good for like genuine competition, but it's like when you're nitpicking the finer nuances of Greek syntax when like there's much bigger issues happening in your classroom, then it's like, well, what is important to you and what are you deciding to put your energy into? So first point of classics helped form race, but two, the more important one is that classics helped to continuously reinforce race in this country. And this would be one that we could probably hide a lot larger from if the entire Black Athena debates in the 90s hadn't happened. If that entire sort of like decade, and the fact that it happened, but is also so strangely like not willing to be talked about by so many of the scholars who were around during that time. Like I remember getting my master's at like Columbia and hearing teachers just being like in hushed tones talking about the 90s and like, well, you just don't understand what things were like then. I'm like, I was alive in the 90s. The 90s were crazy. What are you talking about? Like, I do, like, actually, I might not have been an adult, like, with autonomous decision-making capacities, but like, you know, that's still within my lifetime. But also just like, you know, because they're just like, like people's tires were getting slashed, and I'm just like, that happened at my high school. Like, so like I don't understand what the urgency like, or like the fear and the terror like around all of that was. And I think that partly because of that and because of the 90s, so point three that I want to come to that we need to is classics is actually behind every other humanities field in dealing with race. They've all started, they've all tried, like pretty much since the 90s, they've been doing stuff. Like there have been attempts, to the extent that I thought like going into grad school that there would be more like racial stuff, just because I was like, oh duh, like going to college was like me like realizing like, oh my gosh, there is all of this race stuff in the humanities. It's great. It's just usually like under the table, or like all these, you have to look for it and just like actually search and find it. But then like, you know, I'm finding all these great like Black women pockets of things for me to like do stuff, except classics. It's like the one place where there isn't any. And I was very stressed and freaking out at the end of my undergrad about whether or not I should like even keep going on. So I was like, what's the point? Like, where's community? Like, that's what I need like in education. Like, I'm not an individualist person. Like, I think the hyper individualism in academia is extremely unsustainable and is literally showing itself within COVID right now. But then like getting actually into grad school and looking at the masses of research that have happened and trying to get a much bigger bird's eye, I was just like, oh no, we're just behind and like childish, and that sucks. But there are ways that we could deal with that. However, I realized this intersected with another issue that was happening. So the fourth point that I want to come to is that classics is behind on the digital humanities in a really big way. Different schools have tried to just do their own and break out. Like the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU has done like incredible work with the digital humanities and trying to like actually branch out, and especially with the study of the ancient world, making it more interdisciplinary and more like holistic across the actual like from Spain to Japan ancient world. But other than that, like when it comes to like the fact that technology has been rapidly developing, classics is one of the worst fields in actually trying to use that, which is sad because like we need it. Like the accessibility of like having Latin and Greek texts online is like crazy, like amazing. Like it's already made like the field so much easier to be a part of, just like having these texts like physically online and not like actually having to go and find like the old books in random libraries that you might not even have access to. Like so yeah, all those 4 points of like classics help form race, classics has helped maintain race, classics is behind when dealing with race, and classics is also behind when dealing with digital humanities, are 4 points that I think are really, really important that tend to be missing from the conversation around race in the classroom with Greek and Latin teachers. And so sort of like pulling all of this together, I want to also talk about like things folks can do, but also things that folks can look to and try to like think about more broadly in the sense of race in the classroom and like genuinely what that means. So I'm just gonna like put out a few things for you guys to like think about more broadly. One, race in academia, like 1800 to the year 2000, 200 years of it. Like that is like an insane like spectrum of change. Even just 1800 to 1900 and then 1900 to 2000. It's like 2 separate centuries of just like very, very, very differences in academia. Like the ability to learn, to be able to be educated was like a very elite, was a very like elite skill. Like poor white children like could not afford to go to school. Black children were banned from going to school. Schooling was then used to assimilate and divorce indigenous children from their cultures and to like inherently like take them out of that context and to then like survey, help bring them more into a different narrative if they were going to be kept into society. And then with the emancipation of the slaves and all of these different sort of groups rising up, you then have schools rising up in the early 1900s finally, but then also you have things like wonderful Ivy League professors like wonderful Dunning over at Columbia, who is a political theorist and also studied classics and was friends with a lot of those German classics guys at the same time, writing his like cornerstone thesis and like creating his entire school of thought with his students that Reconstruction ultimately failed because Black people are incapable of governing themselves and we're always inherently going to be taken advantage by scalawag whites or whatever, I don't know. Which was one of the most influential schools of thought that directly went into forming the entire academic system in the South that was segregated in the formation of academic Jim Crow, which was then not really actually even addressed until children in Birmingham, Alabama decided like, hey, we don't like our schools and this is messed up. And so when Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was just like, I need to march and demonstrate, it was actually student revolts that started out the civil rights movements and got things kicked off because they're just like, we will go out and like protest and do this. And those are like, you know, the iconic photos that we see of like kids getting hosed down by like the fire hoses and having dogs like thrown at them. So we have race in academia being very intense. At the same time, we have race and policing and surveillance also like sharing sort of similar echoes. So I'm sure everyone's sort of thought about things around defunding the police ever since that's become a topic of conversation in this country. But what I would much rather have, especially academics, think about is divesting from the policing that happens in their different academic institutions. Now, this can come in the form of campus security, which sucks most of the time. Like there were plenty of racist events at Columbia and Barnard when I was there, especially around profiling. But there's also in America such an intense culture of just policing and surveying children in academia, and everyone. Like, it's not just the Black students, though they get it very, very bad. I mean, Google the school prison pipeline if you would like to know more. But there's so much around academia, pedagogy, indoctrination that just goes into like preparing children for society and culture and the things that they are going to be going out and going through. And the American school system does this in crazy ways. Like, if you've never taken American history classes, like at different points of your life, like a middle school one, a high school one, a college one, and like looking at the differences that you were taught in all three, it's insane. And it's like kind of crazy. And like, I'm also very fortunate that like, this is a time period that I get to like now say this, because in January at SES, I was saying classicists seriously need to take a look at the American academic system in order to actually deal with the issues of diversity in our field. And people were just like, what? But now they're just like, oh my God, wait, maybe you're right, because like academia is dying. And I'm like, I know, because it's actually not had the best history in this country if you poke into it and look at it. And so I think that when addressing policing and surveillance like that in your own schools, the best place to do that is actually just your own classroom and your own self, and the ways in which you might be unconsciously actually policing many of your own students, whether that's policing them through grammar, which is a really, really big one in schools, especially looking up how students and youth like identify themselves through different types of grammar and through different types of language. We should be the most understanding and compassionate towards that as Latinists and Hellenists, but sadly, like the finer nuances of pidgin languages and the fact that slangs and different forms of like these vernaculars and syntax keep arising in different youth cultures seems like puzzlingly like, I don't know. I've said the word dope to describe a classicist like in a class last year, and like one of my professors who's like 35 like looked at me and was just like, dope. And I was just like, oh my God, I'm so tired and exhausted right now. Yes, he's dope. And I think that classics especially tends to be one of the more subjects that deal with hyper-surveillance in the classroom, and in different ways. Like, I don't think this is just like limited to race. Like, I think women are much more hyper-surveyed in classics than many of the other humanities groups. Like, I think especially LGBTQ like people are much like actively stared at, like especially like if they're not very like normatively displayed and are like not deciding not to go the traditional classics khakis route or whatever. But like as someone with tattoos, like that is something people stare at far more often than they're like, oh wow, and she's Black. But so I think that there's also just like a strong culture of surveillance and policing that classicists go through and that we all experience because we're trying to be there. We want to take care of our students. We want to be compassionate. We want to hold on to them. And so this is one of the bigger points now that I want to come to, which is right at the point when our field was being a little trifling, right in the 90s, something was also happening on the worldwide scale that has now entirely changed everything. And it's something that academia actually has yet to deal with. So we're not alone, but we are one of the worst fields at dealing with this very, very new change that occurred in the 90s. That change, of course, the digital boom. We got a tech like uptick. Everything started happening. Like, I mean, and like, as someone who was born like in the last few years of the millennial generation, like I really saw like it change rapidly. Like I remember like being on my computer and your computer was just for solitaire, tri-peaks, and like maybe like a Disney CD-ROM game that like you had, and like that's it. And then like slowly it was just like, oh my gosh, then like suddenly internet was on computer, and then suddenly those like really brightly colored like Apple desktops were like at my school, and I was like, yes, like aesthetic, I love this. But as I went through school, like, and as technology slowly, like I didn't get a phone till my senior year of high school, but like still I was like the last person in my high school to get a phone. But over time also, like I remember when I was single digits, like I would just sit there with like an encyclopedia or then like Encarta and just be like, yes, info, love it. But like by the time I was in high school, like I was adept on the internet at like finding stuff and checking sources and like figuring out what that means. And like we were progressing and getting better at it than our teachers were. And so slowly, and then I also have 3 siblings. So I watched my 2 older siblings sort of slowly go through this process. And then my younger brother also really sort of hook into this. And then as soon as I was in college, I was actually much more online and like really into Tumblr. So I started seeing younger generations and how they were also responding. And so the best of what I can say is that we're actually going through this giant epistemological shift because academia has yet to really acknowledge the digital epistemologies that are forming. The fact that students are coming into the classrooms being like, actually teachers, we have our own sets of sources and like things that we have to contradict you with, that like the teachers actually aren't as aware of the validity of those sources, their potential, unless they do that work too and like really meet the students where they're at to like check that. And so that dynamic I saw like show up in really weird ways, especially around race. So like this didn't happen as much in my Latin classroom, but like, man, like AP US history, it was just suddenly like high school became like the place where like you could kind of like test your like ability and your like know-how like against a teacher of like, because like you could just be like, actually no, I'm gonna dig my heels in on this topic and like start just like slinging sources back at you. And like it became like such a combative like environment, but I was also like, wow, like we were really good arguers. And that did make us excellent debaters, which I think most of us carried into college with us. But yeah, I think the rise in technology is one of the bigger blind spots to classicists around race, because I think, especially when I try to speak to like classicists age 40 and older about it, because they're just like, and the idea that they would just go online and learn things about like how to make the field more diverse, they're just like, what? And I'm like, yeah. I'm like, there are literal techniques. I'm like, other fields have been working on it. We could comparatively do this. Like ask the comp lit department, I don't know. And yeah, so what do people do around race and technology? I don't know, it's hard. And so I think the points that I sort of want to leave you guys with of like things that you can like concretely do in your classrooms more broadly. One is that you have to ask yourself the question, this isn't actually one in the list, this is just broadly, what do you want to do? What's your stake in it? Why do you care? Do you really give a shit? Because if you just don't want to seem racist, then I really don't actually give a fuck about helping you. Sorry, but forgive the language. But like, I mean, if it's for aesthetics and cosmetics, then like there's so much else that you could like go to. And so like, if it's something that you want to do, then do it. But like, don't do things you don't want to do, because I really don't want to hear people complaining about it either. Also, I think it's helpful for people to really interrogate why they do things. Like, I think classicists especially, I think so much of what we do, we're just told to do. But so much of my graduate class was just sitting down with my students and being like, okay, so like, why are you studying this? Why? What does it serve? Why are you doing that? But why? But why? But why? But why? Like, is that funding really enough? Does it give you joy? Like, and just really trying to pick apart like why people feel and do the things that they do, and really understanding that for yourself goes a long way. And I can't actually point to that one enough. I'm just like, what do you want to do? Because people are always like, tell me what to do, and I'm like, autonomy. do what you want, but like, you know, you have to answer that for yourself. I don't like telling people what they want to do. But things you can do if these are stuff that you want to address. One, look to your lacunas. Where are your blind spots? Find them. They are usually very, very helpful towards things that you want to address or go more, or especially things that if you don't know where to start, your lacunas and your blind spots tend to be the perfect place to do so. Two, clarify what's obscured. Like so much of like Latin and Greek is often obscuring because we tend to just try to give like broad overviews. But I would actually try to shine very like harsh lights on things, be very opinionated about things, encourage other opinions though at the same time. And generally try to keep talking. That's also like very important, and keeping dialogue talking about it too. Three, punch up. What? Never punch down. I can't believe I have to tell people this, but I do, because I get so angry and frustrated when I see like, especially teachers coming at their students around things and stuff. It's just like, yeah, if you have things hard, there are probably many things that your students go through that you also don't know. Like this past week, I just saw like the military was getting busted again for like trying to trick like teenagers into signing up for like military cheats, and like, and I'm just like, gosh, right, like kids, you're being preyed on from so many aspects. Like this world is trying to constantly get your energy before, and like your body and all these other things before your frontal lobe is like finished forming, because we want to have impact on you. I'm like, but don't do it. Trust none of us. Like keep yourself safe, please. Yeah, punch up. There are so many better reasons and so many ways to metaphysics your anger about whatever is happening, to always just sort of make sure that you're protecting those who don't have as much power for you, and trying to stand up to those equal or more so. Be more interdisciplinary. Yay. I'm biased. I went to an interdisciplinary undergrad. But also this one might actually just genuinely help, especially around identity and trying to make youth relate to it more. I know especially for undergrads and high school students, I'm not certain for like middle school grad, they often like, they usually have other classes where they're often assigned books or like other things that tend to relate. I would actually just like take some time to be like, okay, yeah, what are you guys reading? Like, what are your guys' like reading lists, your bibliographies you have to do for other things? Like, who are the people you guys have to cite? Like, Zora Neale Hurston is usually on high school and college reading lists. Like, her book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, like explores many aspects of the Persephone myth and also blends them with lots of aspects of Isis and like how that sort of got reinterpreted in Rome. So like, there's one right there that could be like a good segue. There's a movie of it with Halle Berry. I haven't seen it since I was a kid, so I actually don't remember if it's good, but I think it was. But there's also just, yeah, like so much of my reading list from high school and then like undergrad, I've like keep going back to and being like, oh crap, I should write about that. I'm like, oh, I should write an article about that. I'm like, that has reception, that has reception, that has reception. This is crazy. I'm like, and it's also relevant. I love it. And then 5, the big, great, important one. Acknowledge what you don't know. Please, please. It's so embarrassing when you don't. Like, just do it. It's okay. Also, sometimes it like will genuinely catch students off guard and they're just kind of like, oh my God, like what? Lit. And because, yeah, otherwise you can get in not great situations, especially with like some people you're looking after. Like one of the, someone who ended up being my trench supervisor at a dig in Italy last summer, where I was like talking to someone else during a smoke break too, about just like slavery, because we were working out of a villa, and I was just like, yeah, damn, like the slave labor that like went into all of this and like the different aspects, and I was just like, it's like really intense. I just had this like person like cut across me and was just trying to be like, okay, but like Italian or like Roman slave labor was like very different from the Americas, blah, blah. And so then I just started firing back about just comparison points between like the two and being like, well, what about this aspect, this aspect, this aspect? Like, you really just must be thinking about things in terms of like skin color and like your own ideas about America. And just like, they eventually had to back down because they were just like, oh shit, like I actually don't know. I'm like, yes, that's my point. Like, it's okay to acknowledge things that you don't know, and also to like, you know, maybe not butt into conversations just because you're having an emotional reaction to what someone's saying. Like, sometimes we just need to take a second pause and like think, and like listen, and just be like, is this worth my time and energy? Do I want to put time and energy into it? Perhaps, or perhaps not. And also, sort of to close, I wasn't going to do this, but then my mom actually bought it yesterday. She got a bunch of books, which is great. I think we're going to start a reading group. But one of them she got was this book called Anti-Racist Baby, which I love. Also, I just love that girl's look. Like, she has such energy. I'm here for it. And it's really cute. I read it yesterday. I was just like, oh, this is adorable. And it just sort of goes through like all these points that like this little small baby child can like, you know, do to try and like eventually like grow and like to maybe become like an anti-racist adult. And it's just like, cool. And I was like going through, because I was like, these are actually great points. Like, I kind of have to like tweak them a bit for classics, but like I think they're highly applicable to multiple different situations if you just sort of like think through them. And so the book sort of goes into more detail about what it means, but I'm actually going to sort of say each point broadly and say where I think that we could do things differently in this field. So one is to see all skin colors. For me, what this means is sort of looking at areas of alternate colorisms, like the ideas of skin color and what that means, I feel like is so entrenched in these ideas of American race. I think we also lose sight of the fact that like in antiquity, skin color is weird and strange and bizarre. And we actually kind of like are still trying to conceptualize like a lot of it and what it means, like especially black figure, red figure, having mirrors of bronze and like what that does to the like concept of self and like idea of like, does everyone think of themselves as reddish brown? Who knows? And to really actually just try to expand our own ideas, especially since we're ancientists, and so many like of these concepts of race are pretty new, like past 500 years. So it's just like, but they didn't come out of nowhere. And I think that's what such scholars as like I think Benjamin Isaac is like writing about like proto-race in antiquity and stuff. So it's like we can have these like much broader conversations with ourselves if we want to, but it's also sort of difficult to let go of some of those misconceptions. Two, use your words to talk about race. I think this one is very important for classicists, especially since we love the gays and everything eye related and staring at things when they happen and occur. So it's very important to make sure that you are actually speaking about race instead of just sort of observing race. And I think speaking versus observing, I think you can vocally observe as well, but I think you should speak more. Three, point out policies and problem, not people. As I said earlier, punch up. Four, verbal affirmation, especially around race, and that like all races like are chill and great. And this is like a weird one because it feels kind of like obvious, but also kind of like, I don't know, simplifying of just like being like, well, all races are great, yay, like let's just say that. But no, actually, wait, this is a very important one for our field, especially around citing things. Some demographics are more important than others in classics, especially when it comes to whose schools of thought we think are more important. So actually continuously and having that repetition of verbally affirming different types of epistemologies and schools of thoughts within classics is actually incredibly powerful given our privileged position in humanities. 5, celebrate all of our differences. Yeah, there are differences that are great, and not the differences between different types of Virgilian syntax that people are studying, like other types of differences that are wonderful. 6, knock down stacks of cultural blocks. Another one that I think classics actually can do and can help ourselves with. And I think this is part of my appeal to being more interdisciplinary. I think classicists tend to try to narrow, try to figure things out, try to become more individualistic, which at the same time, we're always trying to be like, wait, what are you studying? Or like, oh, can you link me up with this thing? Or it's just like, we need to be more community oriented and like try to think through things in different ways, especially as we are literally going through a structural shift right now, constantly doing things online. 7, confess when being racist. Also important, just be like, oh yeah, I was having these feelings and things like that. This one is also super important that I cannot stress enough, because in America, it's so much more, you are so much more of a horrible person for maybe insinuating that someone is racist than sexist. Like there's not, most of my male friends will be like, dude, that's kind of sexist or misogynistic. You like, do you want to rephrase that? And I'll be like, you're right. Like, let me do that. Like, that's chill. But I'd say to like most of my white friends, like, yeah, that's kind of racist. Want to rephrase? Like, there's like the golden 5 who are just like, yeah, girl, I got you. But then it's just like most of my undergrad ones are just like, how could you think? And it becomes a whole emotional point of just like them having a mental meltdown about being considered racist. And that sort of goes back to the larger point of just like America really doesn't like thinking about race, especially white Americans. It makes them feel really guilty and uncomfortable because they would actually then have to think about more and more and more and more and more. And there's so many better and nicer things to think about, but like it sucks because the rest of us didn't have that option, so we were made to constantly think about it. So instead, I'm here to tell you that instead of crying, just confess. It's so much easier. 8, growth. Yay. It's like keep doing these things, and like eventually, like at this point, you can grow into like being like an anti-racist teacher and having more anti-racist space in your class. But it is a process and it is hard work, and it's not really something you can just like do and flip a switch on. Like it's like therapy. Like it's very boring, but you gotta like keep doing it, and then like eventually clarity will come. Then 9, the final one, believe it. Like believe that like there is a future where this can like exist. Like if you cannot believe it, then like those things are hard to actually like conceive of. And like I always have to go back to slavery. Like slaves had to conceive of Canada. They were asked to conceive of an idea of freedom that like they had never experienced and did not have. And yet they still had to do that, and they still were able to do that and able to conceive and sort of reach for that freedom to escape. And so that's also to end sort of right now what I'm doing going forward with my studies. I am going to be presenting with Danny, actually, one of her round tables at the CAS, the Classical Association of the American South, meeting in October. And I've been working on a resource packet called Pale Past, Dark Presence, Melanating the Classics through Afrofuturism, which is looking at ways in which Black scholars and Black writers and artists have used Greek and Roman myth to sort of negotiate aspects of identity and sort of self-myth-making in America, especially throughout racial structures. So hopefully the first week of October, I'll actually have that up. But also just because so many of these aspects of race and technology, I felt sort of like kept crashing into each other at the end of last year. So at the start of this year, I was just like, okay, like I actually need to meld them together in my field because there's a lot that we could be doing that we're not. And then everything happened this year, and now everyone is online and everything is a lot more digital. That's proving my point that classicists need to learn more about digital humanities. So hopefully this can help sort of push along everyone into the future as well. Hopefully a more Afro future. And yes, that's sort of, are there any questions?